So this book is actually what we started to work together with our contributors since 2019. So we have various chapters. We have actually 16 chapters to introduce what Taiwan faced. Actually, the first Thai administration faced the challenging domestically and internationally. And we started with John and Jonathan Sullivan and Don Lee's chapter to talk about the 3 decades of their presentations discourse in Taiwan, the challenges that Tsai faced, and also Tsai emphasized a lot during her presentation, speeches, and talks. And not very surprisingly, Tsai talked a lot about the new southbound policy, which I would talk a little bit more later, and also the challenges that Taiwan faced domestically. But unfortunately, today John and John won't be able to be with us, but their chapter is looking at a discourse analysis of 30 years discourse analysis to see the presidential speeches and talks. And then we come into Shelley's good paper, which later Shelley will be able to talk more of Taiwan's domestic challenging. Shelley is talking about whether Tsai as a sandwich presidents between the different pressures and the party of herself and also of the opposite party KMT. In many ways that we see the domestic situation has changed a lot, and that's why later on we would ask Shelley to give us her more recent assessment evaluation of whether Tsai is still a sandwich president. Yeah. Gunther and her co-authors talk about 跨岸 and 两岸, 跨岸 and 两岸, and that is a very important understanding of the Taiwan's facing the cross-strait issue has been long of the different groups of 两岸 and 跨岸, and this term Gunther and his co-author has been defined and redefined in very specific terms in their chapter. And then I move on to a very important issue, which is Christopher's chapter to talk about the cyber threat in Taiwan. And in that sense, that Taiwan has developed quite a lot of the civic civic content in a sense of the digital democracy to counter the cyber threat. But as we would understand, Taiwan also facing a severe threat from China has been long. So how does the Taiwanese society and the civil digital environment to counter the cyber attack from China, and especially the disinformation, no matter when, during the presidential election or local election, or even later on? When the book was written or the chapter was written, we were not entering the COVID pandemic crisis. During the pandemic crisis, Taiwan also faced a lot of the challenging of disinformation or fake news, if you like. So I think in many ways, Christopher's chapter has a very important significance to look into Taiwan's cyber security. And in that sense, I would say also the cyber security is important key issue in every democracy nowadays. I move on to Douglas Fuller's chapter to talk about the industrial upgrading and industrial policies during Tsai's 4 years first administration. And in many ways that Douglas has been quite critical to Tsai's first administration in terms of industrial policy. There were a lot of the initiatives or implementations that the government mentioned that it would implement. But in fact, it doesn't really look like the government has been able to push through. And I would think that in many ways that this situation has to be looked into even further. Now Taiwan and the global supply chain faced quite severe challenge due to the changing dynamic internationally. So how would Taiwan to actually get into more industrial upgrading? Douglas Fuller evaluated the 4 years, and I would think, and we would actually to want to see more continuously in the second Tsai's administration, how that would phase out for Taiwan's industrial upgrading. More importantly, Ming Shou and his co-author mentioned a lot about the domestic social movements change in Tsai's first administration period. And to be quite clear that social movement, of course, doesn't just start it from Tsai's administration. It continues, and it will continue. So Ming Shou's chapter actually click very well with later on Yu Qing's chapter to talk about LGBTQ and referendum, those domestic social movement issue to look into how Taiwan shape and reshape the civil society during those a lot of the protests from the civil society to push back of the government's initiative or implementation. And Ming Shou mentioned also a lot of the referendum. It was the 2018 referendum in the chapter that he and his co-author mentioned. But in fact, Taiwan also continuously had more of the referendum. In 2020, last year, December, I would say, another referendum was implemented. So what Ming Shou observed in the chapter continues evolved currently to what we've seen now. Then we go into a very crucial reform that Tsai administration mentioned in the first in her first eras of administration, that is Dong-yuan and his co-authors, to talk about the pension reform. It caused tremendously pushback of the pension reform and quite a lot of unhappiness for the all the pension reform needs. And in many ways, the reform needs probably become a firm supporters to opposition parties. And Dong-yuan's chapter in detailed us to tell us all the challenges that Tsai has faced, and also looked into all the pension reform needs, their complaints and their discontents in his chapter. But I think that again, that this is a continuous process. The reform of the pension goes, not goes alone, but it is a long history of the battle for the government to look into, to not fight against, to negotiate with the pension needs, to look into those issues. Along with the pension reform, there were more reforms or more changes that in the Tsai's government that talk about, for instance, the curriculum reform that which later on we will talk about from Mao Gui and his co-authors to initiate the history teaching in Taiwan's 12 years basic education. Curricular reform, again, is not just only from Tsai's administration. It has been a long time reform during Taiwan's government. And there were quite a lot of the challenges that Tsai's administration has faced. I wouldn't think that this curricular reform has been resolved. It probably gets more complicated after Tsai's first administration. Chun-yi has introduced and informed us even further of the transnational justice, which in Chinese chapter, it looks not really, we would give a rather high hope during Tsai's administration. Transitional justice actually hasn't really reached to what the scholars and civil society would expect. The government has not quite yet delivered the transitional justice, the justice that the transitional justice call for. In many ways, that Chun-yi also, I would think that the chapter doesn't really look like Chun-yi has a very positive opinions to evaluate Tsai's governments in transitional justice. Chun-yi later on could speak more. I think it's also an ongoing process. LGBTQ issue, same-sex marriage. I mentioned earlier in Ming Shou's paper talk about the social movement overlapped and referendum overlapped with Yu Qing's paper about the LGBTQ same-sex marriage. Although it has been brought up, but I would say that the society itself still have quite a reserved attitude towards the same-sex marriage. Yu Qing's paper presented diverse opinions from the society and the difficulties for the same-sex marriage group, LGBT group, to push forward for the society to reform. Another issue Isabel brought us to look into is to talk about the migration and the process of the government to look into migration rights and also the migration groups under Tsai's first administration. Isabel has been quite critical to Taiwan's migration policy and also to the migrants, the protection to the migrant. And I think there are still quite a lot of the critiques again from Isabel's chapter that Taiwan could have done better, could do better in the process, in not only in Tsai's government but continuously. I would come into very quickly to my own paper to look into the first Tsai's administration's policy to look into the new southbound policy. I argue that new southbound policy, although it's not new, but Tsai has established more of the nuance to connect people to people, not just to business group, which is the effort that Tsai would wish to do, but whether business group will be able to fulfill or follow or listen to the government, that's another story. So far, I haven't really seen much of a lot of the difference, I should say, that's the new southbound policy different from the previous one. But it also connect again that my chapter with Isabel's chapter to not just to talk about the money investment, but to talk about the new migrant coming from those southbound policy area countries, whether Taiwan in Isabel's chapter would be able to look after these new migrants from those countries that southbound policy to talk about. This is what I think that new southbound policy, not only to talk about the money, but also to talk about the people. Then it's come to the chapter which Scott was talking about of the US-Taiwan relationship. And I think his chapter is talk about back then that Tsai's government was having quite good relationship with the US government, which is still stands the case. But what we are looking at now is what Taiwan also, the international environment, as we just talked about before our virtual roundtable, has experienced and has witnessed a very severe challenge in so far. So the USA-Taiwan relationship stands to Taiwan's sake, if it's not even more important, I would say, and to be more, it would have more testimonies to see into how USA-Taiwan relationship should be strengthened. Does it need to be strengthened, or it is good as it is? So Scott's chapter again that we look into what later on what Scott will be able to share us more about his perceptions, his observations on the USA-Taiwan relationship. We have a chapter to look into, that is Carrie's chapter, to look into the Taiwan and the Taiwan, Japan, the European Union, and more broadly, not just to look into the European Union, but also Pacific Islands, to look into what Taiwan situates in the situation of the different international communities relationship, which later on, again, Carrie will be able to tell us what's his observation for the current situation. that Taiwan's relationship with Japan, EU, and other Pacific countries. We end our book with Shishen's chapter of Taiwan's international aid. And I would think this is actually a very important chapter in many ways that Taiwan reach out, not just from the new southbound policy, not just from the technical connection with USA, the TSMC, but also more importantly, the international aid. And I think in that sense, I would actually want it just to say again, what our book has been evaluated is at the time, at the circumstance in 2019, 2020, what Taiwan and global environment now has faced have changed quite a lot. This is why later on we are getting on with Carrie and Shelley, your very current assessment to what Taiwan is facing now.